History is not just about the past, it teaches us about the future. Join me as we discover these lessons. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. A young warrior named Osman stood on a hill watching Byzantine soldiers retreat from his land. This moment in 1299 marked the beginning of what would become one of history's greatest empires. Osman was the son of Ertugrul, a tribal leader who had brought his people to northwestern Anatolia. The Byzantine Empire was weak and breaking apart, and Osman saw his chance. He gathered loyal fighters around him and began taking control of nearby towns and villages. His methods were smart and careful. He did not just fight everyone he met. Instead, he made friends with some local leaders and married into important families. This helped him gain support from different groups. Osman also welcomed people from other tribes who wanted to join his cause. He promised them land and protection if they fought for him. His small territory began to grow as more warriors joined his banner. The local people started to see Osman as a strong leader who could protect them from bandits and enemy armies. When Osman declared independence from the Seljuk Turks who had once ruled the area, he became the first true Ottoman ruler. His dream was to create a state that would last for generations and spread across many lands. The massive walls of Bursa trembled as Ottoman cannons fired again and again without stopping. In 1326, Orhan, the son of Osman, finally captured this important Byzantine city after years of siege. Bursa was not just any city. It sat on major trade routes and had strong defenses that had protected it for centuries. When the city fell, it became the first real capital of the Ottoman state. Orhan knew that controlling Bursa meant controlling trade and wealth in the region. He immediately began to transform the city into a center of Ottoman power. Orhan built mosques, schools, and markets to show that the Ottomans were not just warriors but also builders of civilization. He invited scholars and merchants to come and live in Bursa, offering them safety and good business conditions. The city's population grew quickly as people from all over the region came to seek new opportunities. Orhan also organized his military in a new way. He created regular soldiers who were paid by the state instead of just relying on tribal warriors. This made his army more reliable and professional. With Bursa as his base, Orhan began to look across the narrow sea toward Europe. He knew that the future of Ottoman expansion lay in the rich lands of the Balkans. A fleet of ships crossed the Dardanelles Strait carrying Ottoman soldiers toward European soil for the first time. In 1352, an earthquake had damaged the walls of Gallipoli, and Suleiman Pasha, son of Orhan, seized this opportunity to occupy the fortress. This was a turning point because it gave the Ottomans their first permanent foothold in Europe. The Byzantines and other European powers were shocked that Muslim forces had now entered their continent. Suleiman quickly understood the importance of what he had achieved. He brought more soldiers across the strait and began to secure the surrounding area. The local population was mostly Christian, and Suleiman had to decide how to govern them. He chose a policy of tolerance, allowing Christians to keep their churches and practice their religion if they accepted Ottoman rule and paid taxes. This approach would become a pattern for Ottoman expansion. Many local lords preferred Ottoman rule to the chaos and constant warfare between Christian kingdoms. The Ottomans also brought law and order to areas that had suffered from banditry and violence. From Gallipoli, Ottoman forces could now raid deeper into the Balkans. They learned about European military tactics and the political situation in the region. European kingdoms were divided and often fighting each other, which made them vulnerable to a united Ottoman advance. Edirne fell to Ottoman forces in 1369 after Murad I led his army deep into Thrace. The city was strategically located between Constantinople and the rest of Europe, making it extremely valuable. Murad decided to make Edirne his new capital instead of Bursa, showing that the Ottomans were now primarily focused on European conquest. The move shocked Christian Europe because it meant the Ottomans were not temporary raiders but permanent settlers. Murad rebuilt Edirne and made it into a beautiful city with new buildings and infrastructure. He brought administrators from Anatolia to help govern the growing European territories. The city became a gathering point for Ottoman armies before they marched further into the Balkans. Murad also established the devshirme system during this period. This was a practice where Christian boys from conquered territories were taken, converted to Islam, and trained to serve the Ottoman state. Some became janissaries, elite soldiers loyal only to the Sultan. Others became administrators and advisors. This system created a class of servants who had no family ties or local loyalties that might conflict with serving the Sultan. It was controversial but effective in building a strong centralized government. From Edirne, Murad could threaten both Constantinople and the kingdoms of Serbia, Bulgaria, and Hungary. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389 began when two massive armies met on a plain that would become legendary in Balkan history. Sultan Murad I led his Ottoman forces against a coalition of Serbian princes and their allies. The battle was fierce and bloody, with both sides suffering terrible losses. During the fighting, a Serbian knight pretended to defect to the Ottoman side and managed to get close to Murad. The knight suddenly attacked and killed the Sultan in his own tent. However, this did not stop the Ottoman army. Murad's son Bayezid immediately took command and ordered his forces to fight even harder. By the end of the day, the Ottoman army had won a decisive victory even though they had lost their leader. The Serbian coalition was destroyed, and Serbian independence effectively ended. Kosovo became a symbol of resistance for Serbians, but it also marked the point where Ottoman control over the Balkans became permanent. Bayezid, who would be called Yildirim meaning lightning because of his speed in battle, became the new sultan. He was determined to continue his father's expansion. The battle showed that the Ottoman military system was so strong that it could even survive the death of its leader in the middle of combat. Bayezid the Lightning looked at the walls of Constantinople from his camp and decided to blockade the city in 1394. He built a fortress on the Asian side of the Bosphorus called Anadolu Hizari to control shipping and cut off supplies to the Byzantine capital. Constantinople had been the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years, and capturing it was every Muslim ruler's dream since the early days of Islam. Bayezid was confident he could succeed where so many others had failed. He knew the city's walls were incredibly strong, among the best fortifications ever built. However, he also knew that the Byzantine Empire was now just a shadow of its former glory. The city was surrounded by Ottoman territory on almost all sides. Bayezid's blockade caused food shortages inside Constantinople, and the Byzantine emperor desperately called for help from Christian Europe. The Pope tried to organize a crusade to save the city. European knights gathered an army and marched toward Ottoman territory. Bayezid broke off his siege and marched to meet this new threat. At the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, his forces crushed the Crusader army. It was one of the worst defeats ever suffered by European knights. After this victory, Bayezid seemed unstoppable and ready to finally take Constantinople. A mounted warrior appeared on the eastern horizon with an army that would change everything for the Ottomans. Timur, also called Tamerlane, was a Central Asian conqueror who had built his own massive empire. In 1402, his forces invaded Anatolia and challenged Bayezid's rule. The two armies met at the Battle of Ankara, and the result was catastrophic for the Ottomans. Timur's army was larger and included experienced cavalry from the steppes of Central Asia. Many of Bayezid's Anatolian vassals switched sides during the battle, betraying the Sultan at the crucial moment. The Ottoman army was destroyed, and Bayezid himself was captured. The proud Sultan who had seemed invincible was now a prisoner. He died in captivity the following year, possibly by suicide. Timur's invasion threw the Ottoman state into chaos. Bayezid's sons began fighting each other for control of what remained of the empire. This period, called the Ottoman Interregnum, lasted for 11 years. Ottoman territories in Anatolia and Europe were divided between competing princes. It seemed possible that the Ottoman state might completely collapse. Local rulers who had submitted to Ottoman power now declared independence. European kingdoms celebrated, thinking the Ottoman threat was over. However, they underestimated the strength of the institutions the early Ottoman rulers had built. Mehmed emerged victorious from the civil war between Ottoman princes in 1413 and reunited the fragmented empire. He had defeated his brothers through a combination of military skill and political cunning. Mehmed I was called Shalebi, meaning gentleman, because of his cultured nature and diplomatic abilities. His first priority was to restore stability to the Ottoman state after years of chaos. He faced numerous challenges from rivals who questioned his legitimacy and from provinces that had broken away during the civil war. Mehmed dealt with these problems patiently and carefully. He made alliances with some enemies and crushed others with military force. He also had to handle a serious religious rebellion led by a man named Sheikh Bedreddin who preached equality and challenged Ottoman authority. Mehmed suppressed this uprising but tried to be merciful when possible. He understood that the empire needed peace to recover from the disaster of Ankara. Mehmed rebuilt the army and restored the Janissary Corps to its former strength. He also worked to improve relations with European powers, signing treaties that gave the Ottomans time to consolidate. When Mehmed died in 1421, he left behind a stable state that was once again ready for expansion. His achievement in saving the Ottoman Empire from total collapse was remarkable. Murad II faced a new crusade in 1444 when European powers broke their treaty with the Ottomans. The young Sultan had actually tried to retire from rule and let his 12-year-old son Mehmed govern with the help of advisors. However, when Christian forces invaded Ottoman territory, Murad returned to lead the army. The two forces met at Varna on the Black Sea coast. The European army included knights from Hungary, Poland, and other kingdoms. They were confident of victory against what they thought was a weakened Ottoman state. The battle began with fierce charges from both sides. The European knights fought bravely but were ultimately outmaneuvered by Ottoman tactics. The Polish king died in the fighting, and the Crusader army was destroyed. This victory re-established Ottoman military dominance in the Balkans. It also showed European powers that breaking treaties with the Ottomans was dangerous. Murad then faced another challenge in 1448 when a second Christian coalition formed. At the Second Battle of Kosovo, Murad again defeated the European forces. These victories secured Ottoman control over the Balkans and eliminated the possibility of serious European intervention in Ottoman affairs. Murad's military success prepared the ground for his son Mehmed's greatest achievement. The massive cannons arrived at the walls of Constantinople in April 1453, dragged by hundreds of oxen and workers. Mehmed II had been planning this siege since becoming Sultan. He was only 21 years old but completely determined to capture the city that had resisted Muslim armies for 800 years. Mehmed had prepared carefully for this moment. He built a fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus called Rumeli-Hizari, matching the one his great-grandfather had built on the Asian side. Together, these fortresses could control all shipping to Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI knew the siege was coming but could do little to prepare. His city had a tiny population compared to ancient times, and he had only a few thousand soldiers to defend the massive walls. Mehmed brought an army of perhaps 80,000 men and the largest cannons ever built at that time. These enormous weapons could fire stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds. The sound of their firing could be heard for miles. One cannon was so large that it could only be fired 7 times a day because it took so long to clean and reload. The siege began with these cannons pounding the walls day after day. The walls of Constantinople shook and crumbled under the relentless bombardment as weeks passed. Mehmed tried several tactics to break into the city. His engineers dug tunnels under the walls, but Byzantine defenders counter-tunneled and fought underground battles. The Ottomans built siege towers that rolled toward the walls, but defenders burned some and destroyed others. In a brilliant move, Mehmed transported ships overland behind the hills of Pera to get them into the Golden Horn, the harbor that was blocked by a great chain. His men built a wooden road and used rollers to pull dozens of ships over the hill in a single night. When the Byzantines woke up, they were shocked to see Ottoman ships already inside their protected harbor. This psychological blow was devastating. Now the city was under attack from multiple sides. Inside Constantinople, people prayed in the great Hagia Sophia church and waited for help that would never come. On May 29, Mehmed ordered a final massive assault. Waves of Ottoman soldiers attacked different parts of the walls. The fighting was desperate and brutal. Byzantine defenders fought heroically, and Emperor Constantine died fighting on the walls. Finally, Ottoman forces found a small gate that had been left unlocked and poured into the city. Constantinople, the city of Constantine, had fallen after 1,123 years. Mehmed rode through the gates of Constantinople the day after its conquest and went directly to the Hagia Sophia. The great church had been the center of Orthodox Christianity for nearly 1,000 years. Mehmed ordered it to be converted into a mosque, and workers began adding minarets to the building. He declared that Constantinople would now be called Istanbul and would become the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. This decision marked a major turning point in world history. The fall of Constantinople ended the Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of ancient Rome. It also gave the Ottomans control over the strategic waterways connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Mehmed was called Fatih, meaning the conqueror, for the rest of his life. He immediately began rebuilding the city, which had been partly damaged during the siege. He invited people from all over his empire to come and settle in Istanbul. Muslims, Christians, and Jews all received neighborhoods and the right to practice their religions. Mehmed understood that a great capital needed a diverse population. He built mosques, markets, and palaces. The most famous was the Topkapi Palace, which would be the home of Ottoman sultans for centuries. Mehmed also ordered the construction of the Grand Bazaar, which became one of the largest covered markets in the world. The Ottoman army marched into the Balkans again in 1459 as Mehmed continued his conquests after taking Constantinople. He captured Serbia, bringing its lands fully under Ottoman control. The Serbian capital of Smederevo fell after a siege, and the last independent Serbian state disappeared. Mehmed then turned his attention to other regions. He conquered the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast in 1461, eliminating the last Greek Byzantine successor state. He also fought against Wallachia and Moldavia, regions that are now part of Romania. The ruler of Wallachia, Vlad the Impaler, earned his terrible name during this conflict by impaling thousands of Ottoman prisoners on wooden stakes. Despite such resistance, Mehmed continued to expand Ottoman territory. He fought wars against Venice for control of islands and coastal cities in the Aegean and Adriatic seas. These wars lasted for years and cost both sides heavily, but the Ottomans gradually gained ground. Mehmed also campaigned in Anatolia, conquering the Turkish Emirate of Karaman and pushing Ottoman borders further east. His goal was to unite all Turkish territories under Ottoman rule. By the time of his death in 1481, Mehmed had more than doubled the size of the Ottoman Empire. He had transformed it from a regional power into a world empire that controlled key trade routes and strategic locations. Bayezid II inherited the throne in 1481 but immediately faced a civil war when his brother Sem challenged him for power. This conflict nearly tore the empire apart again. Sem fled to Europe after his initial defeat and became a pawn in European politics. Various Christian rulers held him as a hostage, using the threat of supporting Sem's claim to pressure Bayezid. The Sultan had to pay huge amounts of money to keep his brother in European captivity rather than having him released to challenge Ottoman rule. This situation lasted for more than a decade until Sem died in 1495. The civil war and its aftermath forced Bayezid to focus on internal affairs rather than aggressive expansion. He became known as a just and religious ruler who supported arts and culture. However, he did fight some wars, particularly against the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and Syria. The Ottomans and Mamluks competed for influence in eastern Anatolia. Bayezid also continued naval expansion, building up the Ottoman fleet to challenge Venice and other Mediterranean powers. His reign saw the arrival of Spanish Jews who had been expelled from Spain in 1492. Bayezid welcomed them, saying that the Spanish king was foolish to expel such talented people. These Jewish refugees brought skills and knowledge that benefited the Ottoman Empire. The last years of Bayezid's rule were troubled by a succession struggle between his sons. Selim seized power from his father in 1512 through a military coup, forcing Bayezid to abdicate. Selim was called Yavuz, meaning the stern or the grim, because of his harsh personality and ruthless methods. He immediately killed his brothers and nephews to prevent any challenge to his rule. This brutal act shocked many people but ensured there would be no civil war. Selim then turned his attention to the east, where a new threat had emerged. The Safavid Empire in Persia was spreading Shia Islam and challenging Ottoman authority. Shah Ismail of Persia was encouraging rebellions in eastern Anatolia among Turkmen tribes who followed Shia beliefs. Selim saw this as both a religious and political threat. In 1514, he led a massive army eastward. The two forces met at the Battle of Calderon. Selim's army included many janissaries with firearms, while the Persians relied more on cavalry. The Ottoman guns proved decisive, and Shah Ismail was defeated. Selim captured the Persian capital of Tabriz temporarily, though he could not hold it permanently. This battle established Ottoman dominance in the region and pushed the Safavids back. More importantly, it defined the border between Sunni and Shia Islam that largely exists to this day in the Middle East.
Selim marched south in 1516 with a new goal of conquering the Mamluk Sultanate. The Mamluks controlled Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. They had ruled these territories for nearly 3 centuries and commanded respect throughout the Muslim world. However, their military system was outdated. They relied on cavalry with swords and bows while the Ottomans had modern firearms. The two armies met at the Battle of Marj Dabak in northern Syria. The Ottoman guns and janissaries overwhelmed the Mamluk cavalry. The Mamluk Sultan died during the battle, possibly killed by one of his own commanders who had already decided to betray him. Syria fell quickly to the Ottomans. Selim then continued into Egypt in 1517. At the Battle of Radania near Cairo, Ottoman forces again defeated the Mamluks. Cairo fell, and the last Mamluk Sultan was captured and executed. In one swift campaign lasting less than 2 years, Selim had conquered the entire Mamluk realm. This was one of the most important events in Ottoman history. The empire now controlled the holy cities of Islam, giving the sultans enormous religious prestige. Selim took the title of caliph, claiming to be the leader of all Sunni Muslims. He also brought the wealth of Egypt under Ottoman control. Egypt was one of the richest provinces in the world, and its grain fed much of the empire. Suleiman became sultan in 1520 when his father Selim died unexpectedly. He was only 25 years old, and European rulers initially thought he would be a weak ruler after his stern father. They were completely wrong. Suleiman would become the greatest Ottoman sultan, ruling for 46 years and leading the empire to its peak of power and cultural achievement. His first major campaign was against Hungary. Belgrade, the key fortress protecting Christian Europe, fell to Suleiman in 1521 after a siege. This opened the road for Ottoman armies to advance deeper into Europe. Suleiman then turned his attention to the Mediterranean island of Rhodes, which was controlled by the Knights of St. John. These Christian knights had long been a thorn in Ottoman side, raiding Muslim shipping and coastlands. In 1522, Suleiman besieged Rhodes with a massive army and navy. The siege lasted 6 months. The knights fought with incredible bravery, but they were heavily outnumbered. Finally, they negotiated a surrender that allowed them to leave with honor. They would later establish themselves on Malta. With Rhodes under Ottoman control, the eastern Mediterranean became an Ottoman lake. Suleiman's success in these early campaigns earned him respect from both his subjects and his enemies. The Battle of Mohacs in 1526 began when Suleiman led his army into Hungary to punish the Hungarian king for various insults and border conflicts. The Hungarian army met the Ottomans on a plain near the town of Mohacs. King Louis II of Hungary was young and inexperienced. His army was brave but much smaller than Suleiman's force. The battle was a complete disaster for Hungary. Ottoman artillery and janissaries destroyed the Hungarian forces in less than 2 hours. King Louis died trying to escape, drowning in a stream while wearing heavy armor. The Hungarian kingdom effectively ceased to exist as an independent state. Suleiman marched to Buda, the Hungarian capital, and occupied it. However, he did not immediately annex all of Hungary. Instead, he installed a vassal king and withdrew. This created a complex situation where Hungary was divided between Ottoman territory, Ottoman vassals, and a part controlled by the Habsburg dynasty. The Battle of Mohacs was a catastrophe for Christian Europe. It brought Ottoman power to the very center of Europe and would lead to centuries of conflict in the region. Hungarian national memory would long remember 1526 as the year their kingdom fell. Ottoman forces arrived at the walls of Vienna in September 1529, bringing the siege weapons and soldiers needed to capture a major European capital. Suleiman had marched his army through the Balkans and Hungary to strike at the heart of the Habsburg Empire. Vienna was the capital of Austria and one of the most important cities in Europe. If it fell, all of Germany would be threatened. The siege began with bombardment and assaults on the walls. However, several factors worked against the Ottomans. They had arrived late in the year because of the long march and delays along the way. Early winter weather began with cold rain and snow. The Ottoman army lacked the heavy siege guns they needed because the roads had been too muddy to transport them. Inside Vienna, the defenders fought desperately under the command of experienced commanders. They repaired breaches in the walls and repelled Ottoman assaults. Disease began to spread in the Ottoman camp as conditions worsened. After 3 weeks, Suleiman reluctantly decided to withdraw. The siege had failed. This was the first major military setback of Suleiman's reign. Vienna's successful defense marked the furthest point of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. Europeans celebrated the victory as a major triumph. The failure to take Vienna would haunt Ottoman military planning for more than a century. The famous Ottoman admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa arrived in Istanbul in 1533 to take command of the Ottoman navy. Barbarossa was originally a corsair or pirate operating in the Mediterranean. He and his brother had built a powerful fleet and carved out their own state in North Africa. After his brother's death, Hayreddin offered his allegiance to Suleiman in exchange for official recognition and support. Suleiman agreed and made Barbarossa the Capitan Pasha, the Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet. This proved to be a brilliant decision. Barbarossa completely rebuilt and expanded the Ottoman navy. He recruited skilled sailors and captains from across the Mediterranean. Under his command, the Ottoman fleet defeated Spanish and Italian navies in several major battles. In 1538, at the Battle of Preveza, Barbarossa defeated a large Christian coalition fleet led by Venice and Spain. This victory established Ottoman naval dominance in the Mediterranean. Barbarossa also raided Christian coastlines, capturing cities and bringing back wealth and slaves. His raids spread terror throughout southern Europe. The Ottoman fleet under Barbarossa controlled most of the Mediterranean and North African coast. This naval power complemented Ottoman strength on land, making the empire dominant in multiple domains. When Barbarossa died in 1546, he left behind a naval tradition that would keep the Ottomans as a major Mediterranean power for decades. The Hungarian nobleman John Zápolya died in 1540, creating a succession crisis that brought Suleiman back to Hungary. Before dying, Zápolya had been an Ottoman vassal ruling part of Hungary. His infant son inherited his claim, but the Habsburgs also claimed Hungary. Suleiman decided to resolve this situation by directly annexing central Hungary to the Ottoman Empire. This marked the beginning of permanent Ottoman occupation of much of Hungary. Ottoman administrators arrived to govern the new province. They built mosques and Turkish baths in Hungarian cities. The Hungarian population had to adjust to living under Muslim rule. Some converted to Islam, while others remained Christian and paid the special tax required of non-Muslims. Ottoman Hungary became a frontier province, constantly raiding and being raided by Habsburg forces. This created a militarized border zone where warfare was almost constant. Many Hungarian soldiers and nobles fled to the Habsburg-controlled part of Hungary. Others accommodated to Ottoman rule and served the Sultan. The partition of Hungary would last for nearly 150 years. During this time, Hungarian national identity was shaped by resistance to Ottoman rule. The presence of Ottoman forces in the heart of Europe also tied down resources that might have been used elsewhere. It created a permanent state of conflict between the Ottomans and Habsburgs that neither side could decisively win. Suleiman's armies besieged Vienna for a second time in 1532, but this campaign never developed into a full siege like the first one. The Sultan led a massive army northward, determined to succeed where he had failed 3 years earlier. However, the Habsburgs had learned from the first siege. They had strengthened Vienna's defenses and brought in more troops. As Suleiman marched through Hungary, he encountered strong resistance at the small fortress of Guns. This fortress held out much longer than expected, delaying the Ottoman advance by several weeks. By the time Suleiman could continue, it was again too late in the campaigning season. Rather than risk another winter siege, he engaged in some skirmishing with Habsburg forces and then withdrew. The campaign achieved little militarily but demonstrated that Vienna was very difficult to capture. After this second attempt, Suleiman turned his attention to other frontiers. He campaigned extensively in Persia, fighting several wars against the Safavids. These eastern campaigns were exhausting and costly, taking Ottoman armies thousands of miles from Istanbul. Suleiman also focused on consolidating Ottoman control in the Mediterranean and North Africa. The shift away from major campaigns in Europe after 1532 marked a subtle change in Ottoman strategic priorities. The alliance between France and the Ottoman Empire shocked Christian Europe when it became public in the 1530s. King Francis I of France was desperately fighting against the Habsburg Emperor Charles V. To gain an advantage, he made a deal with Suleiman. The two powers would cooperate against their common enemy. Ottoman and French fleets operated together in the Mediterranean. The Ottoman navy even spent a winter in the French port of Toulon, which scandalized other Christians. This alliance was called the Impious Alliance by Europeans because it involved a Christian king working with Muslims against other Christians. However, it made strategic sense for both sides. France gained a powerful ally against the Habsburgs. The Ottomans gained French diplomatic support and a useful partner in disrupting Habsburg plans. The alliance was not always smooth. The French and Ottomans had different goals and cultures, which caused misunderstandings. Nevertheless, the basic cooperation lasted in various forms for centuries. This relationship also led to cultural exchanges. French merchants and diplomats in Istanbul sent back reports about Ottoman life and culture. The Ottomans learned about European politics and technology through their French contacts. The alliance showed that the Ottomans were sophisticated players in European power politics, willing to make practical alliances regardless of religion. The construction of the Süleymaniye Mosque began in 1550 in Istanbul, representing the height of Ottoman architectural achievement. Suleiman commissioned the great architect Sinan to design a mosque that would rival the Hagia Sophia and show the glory of the Ottoman Empire. Sinan was himself an example of the Ottoman system. He had been recruited through the Devshirme as a Christian boy, converted to Islam, and trained as a military engineer. He became the greatest architect in Ottoman history. The Süleymaniye took 7 years to build. It incorporated the best features of Byzantine architecture with Islamic design elements. The mosque's central dome was massive, and 4 minarets rose from the corners. The complex included not just the mosque but also schools, a hospital, a caravanserai for travelers, public baths, and tombs. This combination of religious and social service buildings was typical of Ottoman imperial architecture. The mosque demonstrated that the Ottomans were not just warriors but also builders of civilization. Suleiman's reign saw unprecedented cultural flourishing. Poets, artists, and scholars gathered at his court. The Sultan himself wrote poetry under the pen name Muhibi. Ottoman miniature painting reached its peak during this period. The legal code that Suleiman established earned him the title Kanuni, meaning the lawgiver. Europeans called him Suleiman the Magnificent because of the splendor of his court and the power of his empire. The Ottoman army marched east again in 1548 as Suleiman launched another campaign against Persia. The conflict with the Safavid Empire had become a recurring pattern. The two empires competed for control of Iraq, eastern Anatolia, and the Caucasus region. They also represented different branches of Islam, with the Ottomans defending Sunni orthodoxy and the Safavids promoting Shia beliefs. This religious dimension made the conflict particularly intense. The campaign of 1548 to 1549 saw Suleiman capture Tabriz temporarily, though as usual the Ottomans could not hold the Persian capital permanently. The geography and logistics of the region made permanent conquest difficult. However, Suleiman did secure Ottoman control over Iraq, including the important cities of Baghdad and Basra. These conquests were formalized in the Peace of Amasya in 1555. This treaty established a relatively stable border between the Ottoman and Persian empires that would last for decades. The treaty freed Suleiman to focus on other matters in his final years. However, the eastern campaigns had been extremely costly in terms of money and manpower. They had also distracted from opportunities elsewhere. Some historians argue that the Persian wars drained resources that might have been better used in Europe or the Mediterranean. A crisis erupted in 1553 when Suleiman ordered the execution of his own son Mustafa. Prince Mustafa was popular with the army and many people saw him as the natural successor to Suleiman. However, Suleiman's favorite wife Hurrem Sultan, known in Europe as Roxolana, had convinced him that Mustafa was plotting rebellion. There is debate among historians about whether Mustafa was actually disloyal or whether he was the victim of harem intrigue. Hurrem wanted her own sons to inherit the throne. When Mustafa was summoned to his father's campaign tent, executioners were waiting inside. Mustafa was strangled with a bowstring, the traditional Ottoman method of royal execution. The news of his death caused grief and anger throughout the empire. Many janissaries wept openly, and some officers protested. Suleiman had to execute several officers to maintain discipline. The death of Mustafa was a tragedy that would have long-term consequences. It meant that Hurrem's sons Selim and Bayezid would compete for the throne. Neither was as capable as Mustafa had been. The incident also showed the dangerous role that harem politics could play in Ottoman succession. The lack of a clear succession system meant that capable princes could be eliminated by intrigue while less competent ones might prevail. The sons of Suleiman went to war against each other in 1559 when Bayezid rebelled against his father's decision to favor Selim as heir. This was exactly the kind of destructive succession struggle that had plagued the Ottoman Empire before. Bayezid gathered an army of supporters and tried to seize power. However, Suleiman sided with Selim and sent forces against Bayezid. The rebel prince was defeated in battle and fled to Persia, hoping the Shah would protect him. For several years, Bayezid lived in Persian territory while his father negotiated with the Shah. Finally, Suleiman paid the Persians a large sum of money, and Shah Tahmasp agreed to hand over Bayezid and his sons. All of them were executed. This brutal act ensured Selim would become the next sultan without opposition, but it was another example of how succession struggles weakened the empire. Suleiman had now outlived most of his sons. His last years were sad ones, marked by these family tragedies. The once vigorous sultan was now old and tired. He suffered from gout and other ailments. Yet he refused to stop campaigning. In 1566, at the age of 71, he led another campaign into Hungary against the Habsburg fortress of Szigetvar. The siege of Szigetvar in 1566 became Suleiman's last campaign and the end of an era. The fortress was relatively small and not particularly important strategically, but it had become a matter of honor for the old sultan. During the siege, which lasted for weeks, Suleiman died in his tent. Some say he died of natural causes from old age and illness. The exact date was September 6, 1566. His death posed a problem for Ottoman commanders. They knew that news of the Sultan's death could cause disorder in the army and encourage the defenders. So, they kept it secret. They continued the siege as if Suleiman was still alive and in command. The fortress eventually fell, though at terrible cost to both sides. The Hungarian commander and most of his men died in a final suicidal charge rather than surrender. Only after the army had begun marching back to Istanbul did the commanders reveal that Suleiman was dead. His body had been prepared and transported in his carriage, and servants continued the routine of bringing meals to his tent to maintain the illusion. When Selim II reached Istanbul from his governorship, he was proclaimed sultan. The death of Suleiman marked the end of the greatest period of Ottoman history. Never again would the empire be so powerful, so feared, and so culturally brilliant. Selim II inherited the throne in 1566 and quickly showed he was very different from his father. While Suleiman had been a warrior sultan who led armies in person, Selim preferred to stay in Istanbul and enjoy the pleasures of the palace. He was called Selim the Sought by some European writers because of his fondness for wine, which is forbidden in Islam. This was unfair and exaggerated, but it reflected the fact that Selim was not an active military commander. Instead, he relied on his grand viziers and generals to conduct military operations. The most important of these was Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, a brilliant administrator who had risen through the Devshirme system. Sokollu effectively ran the empire during Selim's reign. Under his management, the Ottomans continued to expand despite having a less engaged sultan. This established a pattern where strong grand viziers could compensate for weak sultans. However, it also marked the beginning of a slow decline in sultanic authority. The sultan was no longer always the active leader of the empire but sometimes more of a figurehead. This would cause problems in future generations when neither the sultan nor his ministers were particularly capable. The island of Cyprus became the target of Ottoman expansion in 1570 when Selim decided to conquer it from Venice. Cyprus was strategically located in the eastern Mediterranean and was wealthy from trade. It had been Venetian territory for centuries. Selim wanted the island partly for strategic reasons and partly because his advisors convinced him it would be an easy conquest. The Ottomans invaded with a large force. The Venetian defenders fought bravely but were heavily outnumbered. The capital city of Nicosia fell after a terrible siege where most of the population was killed. The Ottomans then besieged Famagusta, the last major Venetian stronghold on the island. This siege lasted nearly a year. The Venetian commander Marcantonio Bragadin defended with great skill despite having few soldiers and dwindling supplies. When Famagusta finally surrendered in August 1571, the Ottoman commander promised safe conduct to the defenders. However, he broke his word in a cruel manner. Bragadin was tortured and then skinned alive. His skin was stuffed with straw and displayed as a trophy. This atrocity shocked Europe and became a rallying cry for Christian forces. The conquest of Cyprus was a military success for the Ottomans, but it provoked a strong response. The death of Selim II in 1574 brought his son Murad III to power during a period when the empire still seemed strong but internal problems were growing. Murad inherited an empire at its maximum territorial extent, but he also inherited challenges. The devshirme system that had created loyal servants was beginning to change. More positions were going to freeborn Muslims rather than converted slaves, which created new patterns of corruption and nepotism. The Janissary corps was also changing. Originally forbidden to marry, Janissaries were now having families and trying to pass their positions to their sons. This made them less disciplined and more concerned with protecting their privileges than serving the state. Murad's reign saw continued wars on multiple fronts. The Ottomans fought a long and inconclusive war with Persia from 1578 to 1590. This conflict was sparked by succession disputes in Persia that the Ottomans tried to exploit. The war initially went well for the Ottomans, who captured significant territory in the Caucasus. However, the conflict dragged on for years, consuming resources. Meanwhile, there were also conflicts on the European frontier with the Habsburgs. These wars became increasingly difficult and expensive. The financial strain of maintaining large armies on multiple fronts began to stress the Ottoman economy. A financial crisis emerged in the 1580s when the Ottoman government could not pay its soldiers regularly. The empire's economy was being disrupted by inflation caused by silver flooding in from the Americas through European trade. This price revolution affected the Ottomans just as it did European states. At the same time, the costs of warfare were rising as military technology advanced. The Ottoman government responded by debasing the currency, which only made inflation worse. Soldiers and administrators who were paid fixed salaries found their income buying less and less. This created discontent throughout the military and bureaucratic system. The Janissaries began to riot when their pay was late or insufficient. Sipahis, the cavalry soldiers who were granted land in exchange for military service, found that their timars no longer provided enough income. Some abandoned their lands and moved to cities, looking for other ways to make money. The traditional Ottoman military and economic systems were breaking down under financial pressure. Murad's government tried various reforms but could not solve the fundamental problems. By the time Murad died in 1595, the empire was facing serious internal instability even though its borders remained largely intact. The 13 Years' War began in 1593 when fighting broke out between the Ottomans and Habsburgs in Hungary. This conflict would prove to be one of the longest and most exhausting wars in Ottoman history. Mehmed III, who became Sultan in 1595, personally led the Ottoman army in 1596. At the Battle of Carystes, Ottoman forces defeated a Habsburg army, and Mehmed became the last sultan to personally lead troops in battle. After this victory, Mehmed returned to Istanbul and never commanded in the field again. The war continued with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Battles and sieges happened every year with terrible losses on both sides. Fortresses changed hands repeatedly. The border region was devastated by constant warfare. The financial cost was enormous for both empires. The Ottomans had to maintain large armies far from their core territories. Supply lines were constantly under attack. Disease killed more soldiers than combat. By the early 1600s, both sides were exhausted. The war finally ended in 1606 with the Peace of Zitvatorok. This treaty was significant because it was the first time the Ottomans made peace with the Habsburgs as equals rather than from a position of superiority. The Sultan even agreed to stop demanding annual tribute from the Habsburgs. This marked a psychological turning point, showing that the age of easy Ottoman victories in Europe was over. A Janissary rebellion erupted in 1603 when soldiers angry about unpaid wages and poor conditions rose up in Istanbul. They broke into the palace and demanded the execution of officials they blamed for their problems. The Sultan Ahmet I, who was only 14 years old, had to give in to their demands to prevent worse violence. Several government officials were handed over to the angry soldiers and killed. This incident showed how much power the Janissaries had gained over the government. They were supposed to be the Sultan's loyal servants, but now they could dictate terms through threats of violence. This pattern would repeat itself many times in the coming centuries. Weak sultans could not control the Janissaries. Even strong sultans had to be careful not to provoke them. The Janissary corps had become a state within the state. They had their own interests and were willing to use violence to protect their privileges. The corps was also no longer the elite military force it had once been. Standards for recruitment and training had declined. Many Janissaries were more interested in their business activities in Istanbul than in military service. When called to war, they often performed poorly compared to earlier generations. However, they remained politically powerful because of their numbers and organization in the capital. The Ottoman Empire faced disaster in Persia when Shah Abbas the Great of the Safavid dynasty launched a major counteroffensive in the 1600s. The Ottomans had gained territory during the War of 1578 to 1590, but they could not hold it. Shah Abbas reformed and modernized the Persian army. He brought in European advisors to train his forces in the use of firearms and artillery. When he attacked Ottoman positions, he won victory after victory. The Ottomans had committed most of their forces to the war against the Habsburgs and could not adequately defend the eastern frontier. By 1623, Shah Abbas had recaptured all the territory the Ottomans had taken and more. Baghdad fell to the Persians, a humiliating loss for the Ottomans. The loss of Baghdad, one of the most important cities in Islamic history, was particularly damaging to Ottoman prestige. The government in Istanbul struggled to respond. They were still dealing with the aftermath of the 13 Years' War and internal problems. It took years before the Ottomans could mount a serious campaign to recapture Baghdad. Sultan Murad IV personally led an army east in 1638 and finally retook the city after a brutal siege. This was briefly a moment of renewed Ottoman strength, but it could not hide the larger reality that the empire was struggling to maintain its position on multiple fronts. The execution of Sultan Osman II in 1622 marked one of the darkest moments in Ottoman history. Osman was a young sultan who tried to reform the Janissary corps and reduce their power. He planned to raise a new army in Anatolia that would be loyal to him rather than dominated by the Janissaries. When the Janissaries learned of his plans, they rebelled. They stormed the palace and forced Osman to abdicate. His mentally ill uncle Mustafa was put back on the throne as a puppet. Osman was imprisoned and then murdered in a castle. This was the first time the Janissaries had actually killed a reigning sultan. The precedent was terrifying. It meant that sultans ruled only with the consent of their own soldiers. Any sultan who tried to seriously reform the system risked his life. The murder of Osman traumatized the Ottoman elite and paralyzed reform efforts for decades. Later sultans remembered what had happened to Osman and were cautious about challenging the Janissaries. The empire continued to decline as necessary reforms were delayed or avoided. The soldiers who killed Osman were eventually punished when order was restored, but the damage to the institution of the Sultanate was permanent. Sultan Murad IV launched a reign of terror starting in 1632 to restore order to the empire. Murad had come to power as a child and spent years as a figurehead while his mother and various officials actually governed. As he grew older and took real control, he was determined to restore sultanic authority by any means necessary. Murad executed thousands of people, including officials, soldiers, and ordinary subjects suspected of corruption, disobedience, or simply being in the wrong place. He personally roamed Istanbul at night in disguise, looking for people breaking his strict laws against tobacco and alcohol. Those he caught were often executed on the spot. His cruelty was extreme, but it did restore a degree of order and discipline. The rebellious provincial governors who had become semi-independent were brought back under control. The Janissaries, cowed by fear, became more obedient for a time. Murad also proved to be a capable military commander. His campaign to retake Baghdad in 1638 was successful. However, Murad's methods were not a real solution to the empire's problems. He died young in 1640, possibly from the effects of heavy drinking. After his death, the same problems returned. His reign showed that personal force could temporarily stabilize the empire, but it needed systematic reforms that never came. The empire entered a period of weak sultans and powerful ministers after Murad IV died in 1640. His brother Ibrahim became sultan and quickly proved to be incompetent and possibly mentally unstable. Ibrahim spent vast sums on his harem and personal luxuries while ignoring government business. He made bizarre decisions that disrupted administration. After 8 years, officials decided they had no choice but to depose him. Ibrahim was removed from the throne in 1648 and executed shortly after. His 7-year-old son Mehmed became sultan as Mehmed IV. Because Mehmed was a child, the government was actually run by his mother and grandmother, powerful women of the harem. This period saw women of the imperial harem exercising great political influence, a time historians call the Sultanate of Women. While some of these women were capable administrators, the situation highlighted how the Sultanate itself had become weak. Real power lay with whoever could control the child sultan and the government machinery. This created opportunities for ambitious grand viziers. The most successful was Khosrow Mehmed Pasha, who became Grand Vizier in 1656. He demanded and received almost unlimited authority to reform the empire and crush opposition. Khosrow Mehmed Pasha began his tenure as Grand Vizier in 1656 by executing thousands of corrupt officials and rebellious soldiers. He was ruthless but effective. Under his leadership, the Ottoman government became more efficient and regained control over provincial governors who had become too independent. He reformed the tax system to increase revenue and reduce corruption. He also restored discipline to the military. The navy, which had declined since Lepanto, was rebuilt and won some important victories against Venice in the continuing struggle for Crete. When Khosrow Mehmed died in 1661, his son Khosrow Fazl Ahmed became Grand Vizier. This began the Khosrow era, where members of one family dominated Ottoman government for decades. Fazl Ahmed continued his father's policies. He was both an administrator and a military commander. Under his leadership, the Ottomans completed the conquest of Crete in 1669 after a war that had lasted more than 20 years. The fortress of Candia, modern Heraklion, finally fell after one of the longest sieges in history. Fazl Ahmed also led successful campaigns in Poland and Ukraine, expanding Ottoman influence in those regions. The Khosrow Grand Viziers showed that the empire could still be strong if it had capable leadership, even if the sultans themselves were weak. The Ottoman army marched toward Vienna again in 1683 under the command of Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha. This second siege of Vienna would prove to be a turning point in European history. Kara Mustafa had convinced Sultan Mehmed IV that Vienna could be captured and that conquering it would restore Ottoman prestige. He gathered an army of perhaps 150,000 men, one of the largest armies the Ottomans had ever assembled. The siege began in July 1683. The defenders of Vienna, though outnumbered, had learned from previous Ottoman sieges. They had strong fortifications and determined leadership. As the siege continued through summer, the defenders held on, waiting for relief. The Habsburg Emperor had fled Vienna but was gathering allies. The King of Poland, Jan Sobieski, agreed to bring his army to help. In September, this relief army arrived on the hills overlooking Vienna. The Battle of Vienna began when the Polish, German, and Austrian forces attacked the Ottoman siege lines. The battle climaxed with a massive cavalry charge led by Sobieski himself. The Ottoman army broke and fled in disorder. Kara Mustafa lost the battle and most of his army. He was executed by the Sultan for this failure. The defeat at Vienna was a catastrophe from which the Ottoman Empire never fully recovered. It marked the end of Ottoman expansion in Europe and the beginning of a long retreat. The Great Turkish War began immediately after the disaster at Vienna as European powers sensed Ottoman weakness and formed a coalition called the Holy League. The alliance included Austria, Poland, Venice, and later Russia. For the first time, European armies were not just defending against the Ottomans but pushing them back and conquering Ottoman territory. In 1686, the important fortress city of Buda, which had been Ottoman for nearly 150 years, fell to Austrian forces. Hungary was gradually liberated from Ottoman control. In 1687, Ottoman forces were defeated at the Battle of Mohacs, on the same field where they had won their great victory in 1526. This second Battle of Mohacs symbolically marked the reversal of Ottoman fortunes. In the Balkans, Venetian forces captured parts of Greece and the Peloponnese. The Ottomans tried to counterattack but achieved little. The war revealed how far the Ottoman military system had fallen behind European armies. European forces now had better organization, training, and weapons. The Janissaries, once feared throughout Europe, could not match the discipline of European infantry. Ottoman cavalry was made obsolete by improved firearms. The empire was forced to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously and was losing on all of them. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 formally ended the Great Turkish War and marked the first time the Ottoman Empire had to accept a major territorial loss. The treaty negotiations were humiliating for the Ottomans. They had to negotiate as a defeated power rather than dictate terms as they had always done in the past. Under the treaty, the Ottomans gave up almost all of Hungary to Austria. They lost territory in Poland and Ukraine. They had to cede the Peloponnese and some Aegean islands to Venice. This was the first time in centuries that the Ottoman Empire had become smaller rather than larger. The treaty shocked the Ottoman elite. Many refused to accept that their empire was in decline and blamed defeats on corrupt officials or bad luck rather than systemic problems. However, some more perceptive observers understood that fundamental reforms were needed. The problem was that any serious reform threatened powerful groups like the Janissaries who benefited from the existing system. The empire entered the 18th century in crisis, surrounded by increasingly powerful enemies and internally divided about how to respond. The age of Ottoman expansion was over. The question now was whether the empire could survive at all. The 18th century began with another disastrous war when Peter the Great of Russia attacked the Ottoman Empire. This conflict, from 1710 to 1711, actually ended with an Ottoman victory when Peter's army was trapped by Ottoman forces near the Prut River. Peter had to make peace on humiliating terms. However, this was only a temporary reprieve. Russia was becoming a major threat to the Ottoman Empire. The Russians wanted access to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. They also claimed to be the protectors of Orthodox Christians living under Ottoman rule. This gave Russia an excuse to interfere in Ottoman internal affairs. Throughout the 18th century, Russia and the Ottoman Empire would fight multiple wars. The Ottomans won some battles but lost more. Each war ended with the empire losing more territory. The Russian threat was particularly dangerous because Russia was large, populous, and increasingly modern. Unlike earlier enemies, Russia could not be defeated through one or two major battles. The Ottoman Empire needed thorough military and administrative reforms to compete with Russia, but such reforms were constantly blocked by conservative forces within the empire who feared change. Tulip period from 1718 to 1730 represented an unusual moment in Ottoman history when the government tried to modernize through culture rather than military reform. Sultan Ahmed III and his Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha promoted art, architecture, and luxury. They built gardens and palaces. Tulips became extremely fashionable, and wealthy Ottomans spent fortunes on rare bulbs, similar to the tulip mania that had affected the Netherlands decades earlier. The period got its name from this tulip obsession. Ibrahim Pasha also tried to introduce some European innovations. He established the first Ottoman printing press, though it was forbidden to print religious texts in Arabic script. The idea was to modernize Ottoman culture and make it more like Europe. However, these reforms were superficial. They did nothing to address the fundamental military and economic problems facing the empire. Moreover, the expenses of the court's luxury lifestyle angered ordinary people who were suffering from high taxes and economic problems. In 1730, a rebellion broke out in Istanbul. The rebels, led by a former janissary, attacked the palace and demanded the removal of Ibrahim Pasha. The Sultan sacrificed his Grand Vizier to the mob, and Ibrahim was killed. Ahmed was forced to abdicate. The Tulip period ended in violence, and the failed experiment discouraged future reform attempts. The Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774 proved to be one of the most catastrophic conflicts in Ottoman history. The war began over disputes in Poland, where both Russia and the Ottomans were competing for influence. However, the real issue was Russian expansion at Ottoman expense. The war went badly for the Ottomans from the start. In 1770, the Russian Baltic fleet sailed all the way around Europe and into the Mediterranean. At the Battle of Kesma, the Russian fleet destroyed the Ottoman navy in a surprise night attack. Russian armies also won major victories on land in the Balkans and Crimea. The Ottomans tried to fight back but their military was no match for Russian forces. The war dragged on for 6 years with the empire suffering defeat after defeat. Finally, in 1774, the Ottomans had to sign the Treaty of Kukuk-Kaynarca. This treaty was disastrous for the empire. The Ottomans had to recognize the independence of the Crimean Khanate, which had been an Ottoman vassal. Russia also gained the right to protect Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire. This gave Russia a permanent excuse to interfere in Ottoman affairs. The empire had to pay a huge sum of money to Russia. The psychological impact of this defeat was enormous. It showed clearly that the Ottoman Empire was now weaker than Russia. Sultan Selim III came to power in 1789 determined to reform and modernize the empire. He had studied European military systems and understood that the Ottoman army needed fundamental changes. Selim created a new military force called the Nizam-i meaning new order. These troops were trained in European methods and equipped with modern weapons. He brought in European advisors to help with the training. Selim also tried to reform the government administration and tax collection to make the state more efficient. He established permanent embassies in European capitals so the Ottomans could better understand and learn from Europe. These reforms made sense and might have saved the empire if given time to work. However, they threatened the privileges of powerful groups, especially the janissaries. The janissaries saw the New Order army as a threat to their position. Conservative religious scholars opposed reforms they saw as imitation of infidel Europeans. Provincial governors who had become semi-independent did not want a stronger central government. As Selim pushed his reforms forward, opposition grew. In 1807, a rebellion broke out. The janissaries rose up in Istanbul and demanded an end to the reforms. Selim tried to compromise by abandoning some of his reforms, but this was not enough. The rebels forced him to abdicate and put his cousin Mustafa on the throne. Selim was imprisoned and later murdered when his supporters tried to restore him to power. Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt in 1798, bringing European imperial power directly into Ottoman territory. Egypt was technically part of the Ottoman Empire, though in practice it was ruled by the Mamluks with considerable independence. Napoleon easily defeated the Mamluk forces at the Battle of the Pyramids and occupied Cairo. His goal was to threaten British interests in India and to make France the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. The Ottoman government was shocked by this invasion of their territory by a country that had traditionally been their ally. The Ottomans declared war on France and joined the coalition fighting Napoleon. However, Ottoman forces could do little against the French army in Egypt. It was the British Navy that proved decisive. Admiral Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, trapping Napoleon's army in Egypt. Eventually, the French had to evacuate Egypt. The Mamluks tried to return to power, but a new figure had emerged during the chaos. Muhammad Ali, an Albanian officer in the Ottoman army, maneuvered to become the ruler of Egypt. He would become one of the most significant threats to Ottoman power. The French invasion showed how vulnerable the Ottoman Empire was to European military power. It also brought European-style nationalism and ideas of reform to the Middle East, which would have long-term consequences. The Serbian Revolution began in 1804 when Serbian peasants rose up against oppressive local Janissary commanders. The revolt started as a protest against corrupt officials rather than a desire for independence from the Ottoman Empire. The rebels even appealed to the Sultan for help against the rogue Janissaries. However, as the fighting continued, it transformed into a nationalist movement seeking Serbian autonomy or independence. The revolt was led by Karađorđe, a pig farmer turned military leader. His forces won several victories against Ottoman troops sent to suppress the rebellion. The Ottomans were distracted by wars with Russia and could not devote their full attention to Serbia. In 1813, with Russian help, the Ottomans finally crushed the first Serbian uprising and Karađorđe fled. However, in 1815, another Serbian revolt broke out under Miloš Obrenović. This time, Obrenović negotiated a settlement that gave Serbia a degree of autonomy while remaining nominally under Ottoman rule. The Serbian Revolution was significant because it marked the beginning of the end of Ottoman control over the Balkans. It inspired other Christian populations to seek independence. The success of the Serbian rebels showed that the empire could be challenged successfully by nationalist movements. Over the next century, one Balkan people after another would follow the Serbian example and break away from Ottoman rule. Sultan Mahmud II launched a bloody reform in 1826 by destroying the Janissary corps entirely. Mahmud had become Sultan in 1808 during the chaos after Selim III's murder. He waited nearly 20 years, carefully preparing before making his move. He knew that previous sultans who tried to reform the Janissaries had been killed. When Mahmud finally announced the creation of a new modern army in 1826, the Janissaries rebelled as expected. They gathered in Istanbul and demanded the withdrawal of reforms. But this time, Mahmud was ready. He had loyal artillery positioned around the Janissary barracks. When the Janissaries refused to disperse, Mahmud ordered the artillery to fire. The cannons bombarded the barracks and set them on fire. Thousands of Janissaries were killed in the massacre. Others were hunted down throughout the city. The corps that had existed for nearly 500 years was completely destroyed in a single day. Mahmud called this event the auspicious incident. With the Janissaries gone, Mahmud could finally implement the military reforms that earlier sultans had attempted. He created a new Western-style army with modern training and equipment. He also reformed the government administration, introducing European-style ministries and bureaucracy. These reforms were necessary and long overdue, but they came too late to save the empire from its decline. The Greek War of Independence from 1821 to 1829 was another devastating blow to Ottoman control over Europe. The Greeks had been under Ottoman rule for nearly 400 years, but nationalist ideas spreading from Europe had inspired them to seek independence. The revolt began in the Peloponnese with brutal violence on both sides. Ottoman forces massacred Greek civilians in places like Chios. Greek rebels killed Turkish and Muslim civilians. The war quickly became a humanitarian catastrophe. The Ottoman Empire struggled to suppress the rebellion while fighting wars on other fronts. European public opinion strongly supported the Greeks because of Europeans' romantic attachment to classical Greek civilization. Volunteers from across Europe went to fight for Greek independence. The British poet Lord Byron died in Greece while supporting the cause. The great powers of Europe initially tried to stay out of the conflict, but eventually they intervened. Britain, France, and Russia sent naval forces to support the Greeks. In 1827, their combined fleet destroyed the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Navarino. This was the last major battle fought entirely with sailing ships. With European help, the Greeks won their independence. A new Greek state was recognized in 1830. For the Ottomans, this was another humiliating loss of territory and prestige. It showed that the empire could no longer control its Christian subjects when they had European support. Muhammad Ali of Egypt challenged the Ottoman Sultan directly in the 1830s, creating one of the greatest crises in Ottoman history. Muhammad Ali had modernized Egypt, creating a strong army trained in European methods and an efficient administration. He had helped the Sultan fight against the Greek rebels, sending Egyptian troops and ships. However, he felt he had not been properly rewarded for his service. In 1831, Muhammad Ali sent his son Ibrahim Pasha with an army to invade Syria, which was Ottoman territory. Ibrahim's modern Egyptian army easily defeated Ottoman forces. Egyptian armies advanced through Syria and into Anatolia, threatening Istanbul itself. Sultan Mahmud II faced the real possibility of being overthrown by his own vassal. In desperation, the Sultan called on European powers for help. Russia responded by sending ships and troops to defend Istanbul. This created a strange situation where the Ottoman Sultan relied on his traditional enemy for survival. Britain and France were alarmed by Russian intervention and pressured Muhammad Ali to stop his advance. In 1833, a settlement was reached where Muhammad Ali kept control of Syria but remained nominally loyal to the Sultan. However, the crisis revealed how weak the Ottoman government had become. It showed that a determined and modern regional governor could challenge the Sultan's authority and nearly win.